Well, hello. Welcome back to Real Turkey channel. We have been absent for a while because of things, shit happens kind of stuff. But we're back, and in our first video of the year, it's gonna be a cracking shoot. We're gonna cover everything you know about Turkey, everything you need to know about Turkey in 2023. I have, there's so much you need to know about Turkey. First of all, don't come to this place, man. It's a hellhole. I have shortlisted things as much as possible, and I'm going to keep the discussion at a very general level so that even the President of the United States can understand it. This is the kind of video that you need to watch if you're somehow interested or involved with Turkish politics, economy, markets, trade, etc., etc. And you need to stuff to throw around in cocktail party talk. It's like, yeah, Turkey, biggest narcotics center for Middle East and Europe. So what are we going to talk about? Well, I've sort of, as I've said, shortlisted a couple of things that are both fun, depending on your sense of humor, I suppose, and important. So I'm going to start with the biggest economic problem, inflation, which, contrary to the claims of our president, Mr. Erdogan, may he live 10,000 years, shall not decline in 2023. He is misguided because he thinks he's an economist, but he's just a fool. The biggest event of the year is, of course, May dual elections. By dual, I mean both presidential and for the assembly. They're probably going to be held on May 14th, though that's not certain, and I'm going to talk about possible scenarios and which side is going to win. Biggest threat to national security. One may think it's Ukraine, one may think it's Kurdish separatist movement, but nope, the biggest threat to national security is Syria. Why? Nothing happened in Syria over the last year. Well, I'll tell you why. What's the biggest upside for Turkey, at least for 60% of the population? And I shall explain how I arrived at that percentage. Is a new government, new social pact, and new page in the economy. The biggest downside, Turkey turning into Iran, not in a good way, but in a bad way. Fun fact for cocktail party talk, as I promised, Turkey, now this is honestly serious. There are official reports about that both by EU authorities and the Turkish police commissioner. Turkey is now the narco-center for Middle East and Europe. Of course, I follow the YouTube community guidelines. In no way do I advocate or claim that I use, any recreational drugs, and they are evil. They are evil. Children, don't do them at home. Okay. And the worst long-term problem is climate change. You're gonna hear a lot from me about climate change because it's really scary. Let's get started. Let's get started with inflation. This is December CPI inflation data. You see a major decline because of what we call the base effect. Ignore that. Look at how the chart progresses from left to right, where we start with roughly 10% and then shoot up all the way to 80 and finish the year at something like 64%. Now, mind you, that is the official figure announced by our statistics agency, Turkstat. No one believes in it. I mean, I looked at the polls. 85% of the people say this is complete BS. Inflation is 85. Inflation is not 85%. It's way in three digits. Um, what is the real rate of inflation in Turkey? A simple calculations take the average of PPI and CPI, which were respectively 165%. So, roughly, the underlying rate of inflation in Turkey in 2022 was something like 82.5%. Now, our President Erdogan, proclaimed that inflation is going to decline in 2023. That's because he doesn't understand the difference between annual inflation and the monthly increase in prices. In annual terms, inflation will of course decline because on 21st of January 2021 we had a huge currency shock which immediately passed through to the inflation and started this inflationary surge right here at the beginning of 2020. Of course, in 12 monthly data, as this episode, the portion of the inflation that's driven by the depreciation of the Turkish lira fades out of the data, you are going to see these declines becoming even more pronounced. But that's not how you measure inflation. That's not how Fed measures inflation. That's not Aisha on the street measures inflation. For her, inflation is how much she pays more for bread, for kebab, for sour milk ayran, the favorite drink in Turkey, each month. And that rate is roughly 5%. This is the core rate of inflation. In my previous life, I used to be an economist, so I know a few things about inflation. And what you actually do is look at core inflation data, which sort of weeds out the impact of energy and food prices and seasonality, and looks at the things that constitute a trend, and that is roughly 5%. And that's not going to decline going forward because Mr. Erdogan's policy of combating inflation is not raising the interest rates or restricting income growth, wage and salary growth, or saving on budget deficits, but forcing supermarkets, grocery chains at gunpoint to fix their prices, and essentially calling everyone who or what has raised its price a traitor, a profiteer, and all the bad names in the world. And obviously, this is not the way to fight inflation. If Erdogan remains president after the mid-year elections, Turkey will have chronic triple-digit inflation. Okay, let's move to the next issue in our list, which is the mid-year elections. This is the biggest event. Um, the official date is not yet announced, but my best guess is that both the first round of presidential elections and parliamentary elections, called the Grand Assembly in Turkey, will be held on Sunday, May the 14th. Here, I am showing you the two major contenders for the presidential crown. Mr. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, you can find a lot of videos about him if you look at my archive, who is the leader of the main opposition party, center-left CHP, and of course, our beloved and glorious leader, Mr. President Erdogan. May he live for 10,000 years, because saying anything bad about the Turkish president is a crime in Turkey, punishable by up to 3 years in prison. And I kid you not. Now, you know, if you look up in Google, read anything about Turkish elections, you'll probably get the comment that Erdogan is going to win again, and the opposition is not even going to win the parliamentary race. The opposition, by the way, is divided into two alliances or blocks. The biggest opposition bloc is what we call Table of Six. These are six essentially center left and center right parties, a couple of Islamists thrown in, which have congregated to depose Erdogan. And then there is a smaller opposition alliance centered around pro-Kurdish Rights Party, HDP, and several left-wing parties and single-issue NGOs, like um, combating poverty or women's rights, etc., etc. Um, but I'm a contrarian as far as what may happen in the elections, and I go by data. My guess is that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu will first be nominated as the joint candidate of the main opposition alliance, and he shall handily beat Mr. Erdogan in the second round of the presidential contest, which is going to be held 15 days after May 14th. And in parliamentary elections, the opposition is going to sweep the polls. Uh, where did I get these ideas? I mean, why am I the only person who thinks Kılıçdaroğlu is going to beat Erdogan and the opposition is going to win the Grand Assembly? Well, let me show you a poll here. Unfortunately, most of my charts are in Turkish, but this is in Wikipedia. Just type up Turkish presidential elections and look at the results of the horse races for the second round between Kılıçdaroğlu and Erdogan. I've only sliced out the part of the chart, the table, that shows polls taken between November and January. There are like 11, I don't know. I'm very bad at counting. Never went to elementary school. Just skipped directly to my PhD program. But if you look at this table, there are only two which Erdogan wins. Kılıçdaroğlu wins the rest of the polls. And this is a fact that people just refuse to accept, that Kılıçdaroğlu is very electable. And if we go by empirical data, he wins hands down. If you look at the parliamentary elections, we see a 40-60 split. That's AKP and its nationalist ally MHP currently garner 40% of the vote. The main opposition alliance, as I've said, table of six, roughly 46% of the vote. There are a couple of independent parties which belong to neither bloc, but roughly 12 or 13% goes to HDP and its left-wing allies. So there, too, obviously, polls tell me that the opposition is going to sweep the elections. Now, remember, these 40-60 split is despite an unprecedented and historic pork barreling project by Mr. Erdogan, which, according to my calculations, deployed, not spent, but deployed $110 billion of resources to motivate his constituencies. This constitute of higher minimum wages, higher pensions for retirees, higher salaries and wages for civil servants, subsidized loans, um, $20 billion as a gift from Putin in terms of deferred natural gas payments so his pal Erdogan can win the election. Another 10 billion thrown in by Qatar and Saudi Arabia just because all were Muslims, Muslim Brotherhood or solidarity, etc., etc. Despite this massive spending or promises of spending or electioneering, by the end of January, Erdogan is still losing. So I think I'm correct in my view that the opposition will sweep the polls mid in mid May. Let me just okay. Now let's move on to the biggest threats to national security. It's Syria. Let me show you a map. Obviously, I'm not very good at visual presentations in this channel. Hopefully, one day I'll be able to produce visually exciting videos. This is the map. As you see, Turkey has the longest land border to Syria. Why is Syria the biggest national threat? For several reasons. A, because of the decade-long war, roughly 4 million Syrians have fled to Turkey, and they constitute a huge social program. Look, I'm not anti-immigration. I really feel for these poor people. They didn't come here voluntarily. But let's face it, what they do is drive up the rents, drive down wages. Culturally, they are different, so there's always friction in areas where Syrians and Turks live together. What do I mean cultural different? Well, they're Muslims, we're Muslims. In fact, most of us are Sunni Muslims. Most of them are Sunni Muslims. But Turkish Islam is sort of more mellow. It has more of a secular bent. Even those who are very faithful in their Islamic devotion have sort of accepted, women's equality, women's rights. They don't proselytize anymore, which means they don't condemn people who are not Muslims, etc., etc. Most of the Syrian refugees are not like that. And of course, most of them still don't have jobs, probably three-fourths of them. So they are involved in main trades for people who can't get official jobs, which is prostitution, uh, drug dealing, and other mafia activities, which is very sad. Another problem is, of course, that if you look at the green Syrian map and divide it vertically, in the left, in the left of the chart, at the Turkish border. Mostly Arabs live. At the northeast, it's mostly Kurds. I have nothing against Kurds. I don't think Syrian Kurds hold any animosity against Turkey. But the official view in Turkey, as accepted by not only by AKP and MHP, but also what we call the national security establishment, is that Syrian Kurds are infiltrated by the terror organization PKK, and they're being actively being drafted into PKK's terror activities. And if they ever gain autonomy, as their brothers and sisters had in Iraq, and I hope Kurds in Iran will do so soon, they will constitute a major threat to Turkey. Now remember, at least 15% of the Turkish population is of Kurdish ethnicity. Most of us are mixed. I have like 25% Kurdish blood, so really don't know what percent of the population considers itself, herself, or himself Kurdish. But the net result is there's just this pervasive idea, which is completely false, that you know if there is any Kurdish independent state in this region, it will provoke Turkey's Kurds to seek a separate state or to join them. If you look at all the polls, none of it is true, but this is just perception. Why is it the biggest threat rather than the Ukraine war? Because there is no way to send these refugees back, that there are constant clashes at the border areas, that the areas controlled by the Turkish army have become hotbeds of Muslim fundamentalist activity. And of course, this kind of activity immediately spreads to Turkey because we also have a small but relatively violent uh, Muslim fundamentalist movement in Turkey. There is a lot of drug smuggling. There is no guarantee that once the Ukraine war ends, one way or other, Putin will turn his attention to Syria and help Assad conquer the areas currently not is under his control, which means even more refugees coming to Turkey. It's also an economic threat. Before the war, Syrian trade made border areas rich. Now these areas are not only deprived of the revenues from Syrian tourism and imports, but also suffer from very large number of refugees that are coming to Turkey and changing the local population mix. Okay, let's move on to the fun fact that Turkey is the narcotics center for Middle East and Europe. This is a typical Turkish picture, a police bust of marijuana dealers, and this is the yield. You see it on the picture. I have made some research into this issue, and my very rough estimate at the is that cocaine and heroin flowing through Turkey to Europe is roughly worth $25 billion a year. Add on top of that, of course, domestic consumption of these drugs, marijuana and its derivatives, hashish from Afghanistan, amphetamines are slowly making inroads into Turkey. You get a figure like $30 billion, and of course, this breeds a lot of mafia. If you read the Turkish magazine news, there are a lot of shootouts, drive-bys, people disappearing. Essentially, a the entire Latin American hard drug problem has now been translated into Turkey, which is at a critical juncture between Middle East and Europe. And unless Turkey takes very strong measures to deal with this kind of drug trade, of course, drug addicts in Arab countries and Europe will increase. And it's a serious problem. Both FATF, the money laundering arm of the anti money laundering arm of the OECD, and European authorities have warned Turkey to crack down on drug dealers and other mafia activities. But there is this rumor, which I think is mostly right, that essentially drug trade in Turkey is governed or condoned by our Interior Minister, Mr. Süleyman Soylu, and a former Interior Minister called Mr. Mehmet Agar. As long as these people are in power, as long as they control the police and the ports, most importantly, Turkey will make no progress towards eliminating or reducing drug trade. The biggest long term problem for Turkey, climate change, obviously, this is very trite. It's a tautology. It's a threat for every nation on earth. You should read the latest experts' reports on that. As you might know, that a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in global average climate is considered a catastrophe. It's sort of the Rubicon. Once you cross it, it's very difficult to take back the hazards of climate change, and you could have very sudden changes. All of these things are certainly true, and the sad fact is, given on current commitments of all the national governments vis-a-vis the Paris Protocol or the Kyoto Protocol, the Earth shall warm more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, probably 2.5. If we're lucky, we can stop it at 2 degrees. How does that impact Turkey? Well, in the long term, Middle East and Turkey are believed to be some of the worst affected areas of the world from climate change. In the medium term, as Middle East becomes completely desiccated and Northern Africa, we're going to get millions of climate refugees because compared to what happens in their countries, Turkey still, looks a better proposition. We're going to lose a lot of tourist trade. Turkey is currently barely sufficient in its water resources, but these are being rapidly depleted. By 2030 or so, Turkey could be relegated to the League of Water Poor Countries. Short term problem, we're in the midst of another excruciating drought. I think this is like the third in the last decade, but obviously, agriculture is still at least 15% of the national income, and it still employs millions of farmers. Agricultural, you know, products, their exports, uh, food industry, etc., constitute a much bigger portion of the Turkish economy and still employ millions of the people. And the sad data point is that 70% of Turkish farming is dry farming. That is, it's based on natural precipitation. There is no irrigation system. So you get a bad year, you tap your underground sources and lakes and rivers. When there is nothing left, you start importing. Last year, Turkey imported 6 million tons of wheat. This is a country that used to be one of the major wheat exporters in the world. It has imported more than 2 million tons of corn, etc., etc. And this is not going to end. I mean, since there are really no reasonable policies to change the structure of the agriculture and to make it more productive and resilient to climate change, Turkish food production is going to decline, and we're going to be stuck with higher food prices for the rest of the world. My biggest fear for the year is Turkey turning into Iran. I'm sorry, Turkey turning into Iran, um, in the sense of Mr. Erdogan winning the mid-year elections, contrary to my predictions, and simply continuing with his insane economic policies, as well as remaining extremely divisive. To Erdogan, everyone who does not think like him is an enemy. So he's a Sunni Muslim conservative Turk. LGBTQ is an enemy. Feminists are enemy. Attila Yeşilay is enemy because he's a liberal dude. Kurds are the enemy. People who criticize his economic policies are the enemy. This is called polarization. And I think Turkish people have reached the end of their nerves, like the brave people in Iran. And if Erdogan wins another term, in particular, if that victory is shrouded in midst of controversy like vote theft, voting machines not operating correctly, etc., etc. I think the Turkish people have been very patient for very long, will spill onto the streets, and we will turn Iran into the sense that we will get this chronic unrest, millions of people spilling onto the streets at the slightest mistake of the government, and hopefully it doesn't lead to bloodshed. Well, this has been a pretty depressing and gloomy video. Let's finish it with good news, which I believe is really the future for Turkey, which is mid-year elections being won by the main opposition, and we simply open a new page. Instead of polarization, we get social reconciliation. Instead of insane economic policies, which our finance minister calls heterodox, not meaning what that, not actually understanding what that means, we go back to economic orthodoxy that's dealing with inflation, unemployment, and current deficit with policies widely tried, successful, and accepted in the world, such as tight monetary policy to fight inflation, uh, a lower growth rate and lower budget deficit to fight current account deficits, trying to attract more Western capital to combat current account deficits, stopping dollarization of Turkish financial wealth to combat um, current account deficits, and instituting deep structural reforms in the labor market to increase the average productivity of the Turkish worker so we can lower the unemployment rate. I think all of these are possible. Obviously, even if the new government wins, it will have a lot on its plate. It will start by trying to reestablish a stable inflation and stable currency period, that is, deploy austerity policies, etc. But I think if we can retire Mr. Erdogan and end the damage that he has caused to Turkey in the last 20 years, we can make a new beginning, including those who vote for AKP, MHP, in the sense of a nation that's united again, that wants the same things, which is prosperity, more bread on the table, and that works towards this goal by using consensual and widely accepted policies. Well, we will see by the end of the May. I want to thank you again for your patience. I've been absent for a month. Essentially, I don't know why. I don't have a good recollection of the events that transpired between Thanksgiving and 5th of January, which happens my birthday. I have this fleeting sense that I was outside the solar system, somewhere around Barnard's star, doing really filthy things with funky alien chicks, but that could be just an hallucination. But be rest assured, despite low traffic, low quality, and largely poor commentary, Real Turkey channel will be around as long as Mr. Attila Yeşilada is alive and can finance it, and most importantly, as long as he has to say something. He has something to say. If you like, subscribe, share, and punch that like button. If you don't like it, well, then you're an ultra right wing MK, ultra fascist human hater who should be cancelled. Goodbye.